Friday, April 5th, 1996. La Frenaye, a small village in Upper Normandy, France. At 1 p.m., two sisters, Nadine and Marilène, got out of their car and entered Nadine's house. That day, as they did every Friday, the sisters had lunch together. The girls set the table and began their meal when the older sister, 28-year-old Nadine, noticed that 17-year-old Marilène wanted to talk about something. Finally, Marilène gathered her courage and confessed to her sister that she wanted to spend Saturday night with friends, including a boy she really liked. She asked Nadine to cover for her, but Nadine categorically refused to lie to their parents, especially since she also felt her sister was too young for such things. Although Marilène was already 17, she rarely attended parties or stayed overnight at friends' houses, and her family simply wasn't used to the idea. It was hard for them to accept that their little Marilène had grown up. Marilène agreed with Nadine's reasoning, and the sisters dropped the subject. They finished their meal, and Nadine began getting ready. It was time for her to return to work. Marilène, on the other hand, had to stop by school and then head home. But first, as she did every Friday, she stayed behind to do some house chores to help her sister. Nadine worked as a secretary at the front desk of a medical laboratory, but by the end of the day, she received a most unexpected call. On the other end of the line was her husband, Jean-Yves Morel, and he sounded deeply puzzled. Jean-Yves had returned home from work around 4:30 p.m. By that time, Marilène had already left, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the note she had left for her sister. It read, "I'm leaving. Don't worry about me. We'll see each other again, but not before Tuesday." This message deeply unsettled Nadine. The sisters had agreed that Marilène wouldn't go to the overnight party and would spend Saturday evening at home. Why had she run away? Marilène wasn't the type to defy her parents' or older sister's wishes just to get her way. But then Jean-Yves dropped another bombshell. A 100-franc bill was missing from the pocket of his coat, which had been hanging at home. Nadine couldn't believe it. None of this resembled her younger sister at all. She returned home, hoping Marilène would change her mind and show up at the doorstep. But when there was still no sign of her by 8:30 p.m., the couple got in their car and drove to the neighboring village to deliver the news in person to the girl's parents. After some discussion, they decided to wait until Tuesday, as mentioned in Marilène's note. When the day came and she still hadn't appeared, Marilène's father went to the police. He showed the officers the note and confirmed that his daughter had written it. A handwriting analysis later validated this. He also had to admit that she had wanted to attend a party, but had been forbidden to go. Unfortunately, after listening to his account, the officers concluded that the girl had run away. This hypothesis seemed supported by the minor argument between the sisters and the stolen money. Of course, the police filed the missing persons report and distributed Marilène's photo and description to other precincts. But frankly, their search efforts were half-hearted at best. However, her family knew that Marilène was a very home-oriented girl. She had a small circle of close friends, always came home on time, and never got involved in any trouble. This is why they began their search on their own. They distributed and posted flyers. Jean-Yves, who felt responsible for the disappearance of his sister-in-law since she had vanished from his home, suggested reaching out to a TV program that had gained much attention in those years. Unfortunately, it yielded no results. Finally, after 3 weeks, Dennis and Jeanette Rousset asked the police to initiate an administrative investigation in the interest of the family. The police interviewed people who might have seen the girl before her escape, classmates, taxi drivers, and bus operators. However, their meticulous efforts spanning several weeks led to no breakthroughs. By December 1996, there had been no news of Marilène for 8 months. However, the situation took a significant turn. She was now considered an adult. As a result, the police ceased their search. Before her 18th birthday, her parents were legally responsible for her. And if the police had located her, they would have been obligated to inform the Rousset family of her whereabouts. However, after Marilène turned 18, the police were no longer permitted to disclose her location to her family, as it was assumed she did not wish to maintain contact with them. The most they could do was inform the family that their daughter was alive and well. Unfortunately, a second disappearance was necessary for the police to abandon the theory of Marilène's escape. A year later, on June 24, 1997, Elisabeth Griffin disappeared. The 23-year-old was a natural sciences student at a university in Rouen and went missing during the peak of exam season. The initial exam results were already announced, and Elisabeth had arranged to meet a friend outside the university building to check the results together. Her friend waited and scanned the crowd for Elisabeth, but she never showed up. Elisabeth's boyfriend, Thomas Deschamps, repeatedly tried to call her without success. Finally, her friends and boyfriend notified her family that they couldn't get in touch with her. Elisabeth's father, sister, and brother traveled to Rouen. They inspected her apartment, which appeared completely normal. However, her car was missing from the parking lot, along with her handbag. It seemed she had gone somewhere, but leaving during the exam period without telling anyone was entirely unlike her. Moreover, the anniversary of Elisabeth's mother's death was approaching, and she would not have jeopardized that time with an impulsive disappearance. The Griffin family reported her missing to the police. Thankfully, the officers listened and immediately began searching for her. Though there were no signs of foul play in her apartment, forensic investigators collected DNA samples just in case. Apart from Elisabeth's own DNA, they found samples belonging to her boyfriend, Thomas Deschamps, and one other unidentified sample, which would never be identified. At the phone company, investigators obtained a list of the girl's last incoming and outgoing calls. One call received at her home on June 24th at 7:59 a.m. seemed particularly important. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Naturally, the police traced the origin of the call. It came from a phone booth near Lillebonne, a small town about 60 kilometers from Rouen. Hoping the caller had used a bank card, which could identify them, the police were disappointed when no such transaction had been made. They then investigated whether the caller had made any additional calls from the same booth around the same time, but this too led nowhere. That day, only one call had been made from that booth. Elisabeth's car was found on the second day of the search. It had been abandoned with the door wide open in a parking lot in Lillebonne. Her handbag was left on the seat. Her sister, Geraldine, confirmed it was Elisabeth's car, but couldn't imagine why her sister had gone to Lillebonne. As far as she knew, Elisabeth had no friends or business in that town. Forensic investigators inspected the car, but found no fingerprints or DNA. Inside Elisabeth's handbag was a handwritten note that read, Fred, 24th, 10 a.m. The note clearly hinted at a meeting. Given the date and time, Fred appeared to be the person who had called from the phone booth. Indeed, there was a Fred in Elisabeth's circle, specifically Frédéric, a friend of her boyfriend, Thomas Deschamps. The police quickly imagined a potential rivalry between the two women over Thomas. However, after questioning Frédéric at the station, they ruled out her involvement. Elisabeth's boyfriend, Thomas Deschamps, on the other hand, behaved oddly, if not suspiciously. Not long after her disappearance, while her friends and especially her family were consumed with worry, Thomas left for Spain to work as a camp counselor for the summer. Thomas drew some suspicion with his behavior. Though he was detained briefly to verify his statements, the investigators wanted to leave no stone unturned. After 12 hours of questioning, Thomas was released due to having a solid alibi. Both he and Elisabeth were students, occasionally argued, but otherwise had a normal relationship. Determined not to miss any leads, investigators thoroughly examined Elisabeth's journal, scrutinizing it line by line and name by name. One name, Jean-Yves Morel, appeared more frequently than others. The police recognized the name. Jean-Yves was a relative of Marilène Griffin, who had disappeared a year earlier. Lillebonne, where Elisabeth's car was found, was less than 5 kilometers from La Frenaye. Moreover, the two missing young women bore an uncanny resemblance to one another. The police became interested in the connection between Jean-Yves and Elisabeth. It turned out that during her university studies, Elisabeth had interned at several companies, one of which was a pharmaceutical laboratory where Jean-Yves worked as a technician. Investigators revisited Elisabeth's call log to see if she and Jean-Yves had stayed in touch after her internship. The answer was yes. On June 16, 1997, at 11:20 a.m., Elisabeth had called him. Investigators decided it was time to speak with him personally. Jean-Yves confirmed the June 16th call, explaining that Elisabeth had contacted him to inquire about completing another internship at the laboratory and had asked for his assistance. During questioning, Jean-Yves appeared relaxed. He was exceedingly talkative, sharing details the police hadn't even asked about. He came across as a pleasant, helpful, and courteous person, speaking softly and respectfully while demonstrating a willingness to aid the investigation. Jean-Yves was highly educated, employed in a respected laboratory, and raising a young daughter with his wife. He enjoyed water sports, owned a small boat, regularly attended church, and took pride in maintaining his garden and home. On the surface, Jean-Yves did not resemble a potential abductor in the slightest. The police let him go, as his connections to the two missing women appeared to be coincidental. However, a few days later, investigators discovered something crucial. Jean-Yves had no alibi for June 24th and 25. He had taken both days off. Though they had no reason to formally suspect him, the police felt compelled to dig deeper. Perhaps it was intuition. The police obtained a warrant to search his house, where they found newspaper clippings and photos of the missing girls. In the attic, there was an impressive collection of pornographic films, 140 tapes, as well as numerous magazines on the same topic. Nothing criminal, But the discovery did not match the image the man had portrayed. Essentially, he revealed a new side to the police. Due to these findings, his wife was also detained. She explained that he was very demanding in the sexual sense. They had a child, and he had insisted on regular marital relations throughout her pregnancy. His DNA was compared with a sample found in Elisabeth's house. They did not match. Due to the lack of a DNA match, the investigators tried another lead, a note found in the car. The man might have written it to send the police on a false trail. However, the results of the examination turned out to be negative. The police were convinced they were right, but there was no proof. The police had a single lead they could essentially work with: the mileage recorded on the odometer of Elisabeth's car. That day, the car had traveled 57 kilometers. Detectives could confirm this with certainty because, as the girl's family explained, she had a habit of resetting the odometer to 0 every morning before driving. The investigators decided to conduct an experiment. They drove from Elisabeth's apartment in Rouen to the Morel family home in La Frenaye, and then from their house to the place where the car had been found in Lillebonne. They saw that the odometer displayed a number identical to the distance Elisabeth's car had traveled that day. On October 9th, Jean-Yves Morel was arrested. They had to release him once again, but the man vehemently denied any connection to Elisabeth's disappearance. He made an unexpected statement. He had seen Elisabeth after her disappearance on the 26th of the month. He had seen her in Lillebonne in the company of other girls. The police suspected that Jean-Yves, at the very least, wasn't telling the full truth. However, since he claimed to have seen the girl after her disappearance, they were obliged to release him and verify his statement. The police were unable to find any witnesses who could confirm his words, including the other girls. Since the man continued to deny any involvement, Elisabeth's disappearance could have remained unsolved if not for an interesting twist. On January 6, 1998, Elisabeth's father, Dr. Griffin, went to the police station and reported that he had received an anonymous call. The unknown person told him that Jean-Yves Morel was connected to the disappearance of another girl who was strikingly similar to Elisabeth. The police never learned the identity of the anonymous caller, but the person did not stop there. Apparently, the same anonymous individual contacted a journalist from the magazine New Detective and told him essentially the same thing. He stated that both cases were linked by a man who had been digging something in his garden at the time of the girls' disappearances. The anonymous caller didn't say anything else, but the journalist didn't need more. He learned about the second missing girl, Marilène Russet, and took the risk of calling Jean-Yves Morel. The man's voice sounded tense, but he claimed to have no involvement in the disappearances. He insisted that they were doing everything possible to find Marilène. However, the journalist wrote an article and listed all the details that were common to both cases. After his article, all eyes turned toward Jean-Yves, including the police's. They were particularly interested in the fact that Jean-Yves had been digging in his garden during the disappearances of his sister-in-law and friend. Clinging to their last hope, the detectives learned everything they could about the Morel family's house. The couple had bought the house 2 years earlier and had made several changes. The police contacted the previous owner to find out the state of the house when he sold it. It turned out that the new owners had significantly altered the property. They had built a terrace, updated the garage floor, and planted new trees. In particular, in the summer of 1997, Jean-Yves had poured concrete for the terrace behind the house. Therefore, early in the morning, on April 28, 1998, investigators arrived with a search warrant for the Morel family garden. Jean-Yves personally greeted them. The detectives brought with them a ground-penetrating radar, a device capable of detecting the slightest anomaly beneath the ground without having to dig up the entire garden. Using the radar, they scanned the property meter by meter. The most irregular zone was found in the garage. After clearing the garage of items, the officers began to dig. After removing about a meter of soil, they heard a ringing sound. The shovel had struck a concrete slab. They placed the radar on the slab, but the device showed that there was simply an empty space beneath it. The detectives couldn't explain this void and decided to break the slab. They got to work with a jackhammer. By this point, they had spent the whole day on the garden search, and night was approaching. The detectives armed themselves with flashlights and, amid the deafening noise of the jackhammer, waited to see what they would find underneath. Morel stood nearby. He was calm and relaxed, perhaps because there was nothing under the slab except for a new layer of earth. The police were ready to admit defeat. They had spent a tremendous amount of effort, time, and resources pursuing a man whose only fault appeared to be that he knew 2 missing girls. While the police spent almost the entire day searching through his garden and digging in the garage, Jean-Yves remained completely calm. He engaged in casual conversations with the detectives, discussing topics like his vacation or his boat. However, when the police broke the concrete slab under the garage floor, the man briefly stepped away to call his wife. Although he appeared calm, inside he was clearly not at peace. During the call to Nadine, he didn't say anything specific, but simply asked her to take care of their daughter. Nadine, clearly understanding, began saying, "No, no, no." Had it not been for this call, the police might have given up. But neither Jean-Yves nor Nadine knew that all their calls were being monitored. An officer who overheard the conversation immediately contacted the colleagues working in the garden and urged them to continue. A small excavator was brought in to assist with the digging. As it was scooping earth, a small, shiny triangle of tarpaulin appeared from under the soil. Everything froze. The noise stopped. Everyone waited to see what would be revealed beneath the tarpaulin. One of the officers took a knife, descended into the hole, and made a cut. Instantly, they all smelled a scent that could not be mistaken for anything else. Their search had come to an end. Meanwhile, Jean-Yves took a step back. It was unlikely that he seriously intended to escape. It was more likely an instinctive, unconscious movement. The detectives quickly stopped him and asked, "Who is this?" He answered, "Elisabeth." They would have figured it out quickly, as the victim was wearing a necklace with a golden dolphin that Elisabeth always wore. In addition, she was only in her bra. The police informed Jean-Yves' wife, Nadine, of the news. If she had previously hoped that she misunderstood her husband, that hope was now shattered. She became so distressed that she required medical attention. Throughout the night, the police carefully excavated all of Elisabeth's remains and sent them for an autopsy. In the morning, they still had two important tasks ahead: to inform the victim's family and to interrogate the murderer. Jean-Yves explained that he was in his garden when Elisabeth unexpectedly arrived. She was very angry because he had promised to help her complete an internship in the laboratory where he worked, but had not done so. Elisabeth allegedly lost her temper and threatened to tell his wife about their affair. Jean-Yves lost control and pushed her. Elisabeth hit her head and died. It was a tragic accident, and Elisabeth had been the one to start the argument. The police did not believe him for a moment. First of all, it was hard to believe that the girl would come to him in just a bra. Secondly, it seemed clear that she had been severely beaten, not just struck once. The investigator tried to explain to Jean-Yves that if he didn't tell the truth, he would alienate people who still wanted to help him, such as his sisters. Jean-Yves paused to think, and at that moment something happened that the police hadn't planned. A female officer entered the interrogation room. She offered coffee to her colleagues, who accepted. Jean-Yves, who also wanted coffee, asked her to bring him a cup as well. The woman turned to him with some disdain and said, "No, definitely not for you." The detective then told him, "You understand what I mean." Jean-Yves, unaccustomed to such contempt, seemed shaken. Up until that point, people had only noticed his positive qualities, and no one had seen him as a monster. This seemingly insignificant incident had an effect. Jean-Yves told the detectives a different version, one they believed. He said that on the morning of the day Elisabeth disappeared, he called her from a phone booth and invited her over under a pretext. When she arrived, he tried to make love to her. She did not reciprocate and attempted to leave, but the murderer had other plans. Jean-Yves assaulted her and at least struck her severely on the tiled floor about 7 times. Under the garage floor, he had already dug a large hole for a wine cellar. He transported her body to the garage on a dolly, threw it into the hole, buried it, and covered it with boards. Then he placed his bicycle in the trunk of Elisabeth's car, drove the car toward the town of Clairvaux, wrote a note with his left hand, left the car with the door open, hoping someone would take it, and rode his bike back home. Later, when the builders arrived to work on the terrace, he asked them to pour more cement under the garage floor. Afterward, he continued living as though nothing had happened. When asked about Marilène, his sister-in-law, he claimed to know nothing about her disappearance. On May 3rd, just a few days after his arrest, while in his cell, the man attempted to end his life all at once. But he failed and remained alive. The detectives decided to take advantage of Jean-Yves' condition and question him again about his sister-in-law, this time in a home setting. The plan worked. Once in the garden of his house, Jean-Yves led them to the spot where he had buried Marilène. In his garden, there was a very young tree, more like a bush, which Jean-Yves had planted not long ago. He looked at the officers with a neutral expression and nodded toward the area they should dig. The semi-naked body of Marilène was unearthed a few meters from the garage, where they had already found the body of Elisabeth. In light of this new discovery, Jean-Yves was now questioned about the murder of Marilene. The man claimed that she had been his mistress for some time, and on the day of her disappearance, she threatened to tell her sister Nadine everything unless he gave her at least 3,000 francs. An argument broke out, and he accidentally pushed Marilene, causing her to fall, hit her head, and die. At that moment, he was about to plant a new tree near the fence, so he had already prepared a hole. He threw the girl into the hole and then buried her along with the new sapling. It was very convenient that every time aggressive girls attacked him, he had a big hole ready. The trial began on February 16, 2000. The building was overcrowded as everyone wanted to see the monster, but what they saw was just an ordinary 35-year-old man. The trial was not without surprises. The first of these was that Jean-Yves once again changed his testimony and insisted that he never planned to kill the girls. He returned to his original version for a reason. If he had sexually assaulted both girls and then killed them, he would have faced life imprisonment. But if he had not assaulted them and the girls really died by accident, he could face 20 years in prison, even though that there were two victims. After all, he was being tried for both cases simultaneously. The defense lawyers did not deny that their client had dealt fatal blows to the victims, but tried to soften the jurors' attitude toward the defendant. Psychologists helped to better understand the accused's personality. In childhood, he struggled to meet his father's expectations. Jean-Yves' sisters spoke of the madness that occurred in their family home. For example, when the father returned home in the evening after work, all family members were required to be home. His mother served dinner in outfits that could only be described as excessively erotic. But that was not all. The sisters said that when young Jean-Yves made a mistake in his math homework, his father would take one sea turtle after another from the aquarium and beat them with a hammer in front of the little boy's eyes. Naturally, such upbringing methods and the atmosphere in the home had an impact on the child and his relationship with women and violence. As he grew older, Jean-Yves tried to harm himself for the first time, but he survived and was forced to be under psychiatric observation. However, not all children who experience a difficult childhood grow up to be cruel murderers. The jurors, possibly moved by the man's childhood, sided with the prosecution because the prosecutor managed to prove that Marilene and Elisabeth did not die as a result of an unfortunate accident. Starting with how similar the victims were, they were found naked and had been horribly beaten. Moreover, the man took a day off and made a call from a phone booth not by chance, but to cover his tracks. But the most shocking news for everyone present in the courtroom, especially for Marilene's family, was that she was alive when Jean-Yves buried her. Unconscious, but alive. Had he wanted to, he could have saved her, but he chose not to for obvious reasons. It was already hard for her family to come to terms with the fact that Jean-Yves had dishonored her by claiming that she was his mistress and had blackmailed him. And now this. It was a double blow. But they managed to accept all the news stoically and with dignity. On February 20th, 2000, after 3 days of trial, the defendant was given the floor. He apologized to the families of the victims. 4 hours later, the jurors delivered their verdict. They found him guilty of the assault and murder of Elisabeth and the murder of Marilene. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, which is the maximum sentence in France. Jean-Yves killed 2 girls within just 1 year. Therefore, investigators could not help but wonder, could he have become a serial killer if he hadn't been stopped? Or would the list of victims have continued to grow? No one knows the answer to this question except perhaps Jean-Yves Morel himself. One can only hope he does not try to make up for lost time, because in 2022, not yet a frail old man, but a 57-year-old Jean-Yves Morel was released from prison.